4 years, one man carried the blame for unleashing the deadliest epidemic of the modern age. A flight attendant, a traveler. A name whispered with fear across an entire continent. They called him Patient Zero, the man who supposedly started it all. Newspapers ran his photo. Governments pointed fingers. An entire country needed someone to blame. Default text. Welcome back, my friends. Tonight, we're not telling a story from ancient scrolls or forgotten kingdoms. Tonight's story is written in something far smaller, in genetic code, in blood samples frozen since 1959, in a mistake made by a typewriter decades ago that changed how the world saw an entire disease. This is the true story of how AIDS began and how an innocent man became history's most famous scapegoat. Section 1. The first warning. 110. Our story begins not in Africa, but in Los Angeles in the summer of 1981. A handful of young, otherwise healthy men began arriving at hospitals with infections doctors almost never saw outside of the critically ill rare lung infections, rare cancers, immune systems collapsing for no visible reason. Knee case could be a coincidence. 2. A strange one. But when a third patient appeared with the exact same pattern, physicians realized they weren't looking at isolated illness. They were looking at the opening moments of something new. Within weeks, doctors on the other side of the country, in New York, began reporting a similar mystery. The connecting thread in every case, a devastated immune system, and one particular type of white blood cell disappearing from the bloodstream almost entirely. Researchers soon isolated the cause. A virus never before identified in humans. They named it HIV. The collapse of the immune system it caused had a name to AIDS. But knowing the name of a killer is not the same as understanding it. And this virus, it turned out, was unlike anything medicine had encountered before. Here is what makes HIV so quietly terrifying. It doesn't attack your lungs, your skin, or your blood directly. Destroy the general, and the entire army loses its ability to fight. But the truly strange part comes next. Once inside a cell, HIV can splice a copy of its own genetic instructions directly into your DNA, becoming part of you. Invisible, dormant, waiting. It can sit there silently 4 years before finally activating and collapsing the body's defenses from the inside. And it does something even rarer for a virus. It runs biology backwards. Nearly all life. So where did something this strange come from? The answer wasn't in a laboratory. It wasn't a modern invention. It was already living quietly in the forests of Central Africa, inside wild primates, for who knows how long. Scientists compared HIV's genetic signature to viruses found in monkeys and apes across the African continent, and the match was unmistakable. One version of the version responsible for the global pandemic, the one behind more than 85 million infections, traced back to something else entirely. Wild chimpanzees in a remote region of Cameroon. This wasn't a virus born in secret. It was a virus that simply crossed over from animal to human, the way viruses occasionally do. And remarkably, scientists discovered this. Crossing didn't happen just once. It happened at least 4 separate times. 3 of those 4 crossings barely spread beyond a handful of people. But one strain, known simply as Group M, went on to cause a global catastrophe. The question that mattered most wasn't just where the virus came from. The most likely explanation is almost unbearably simple. For generations, hunters across Central Africa have butchered wild animals for meat, including primates, And butchering an animal means using a blade close to blood, both the animal's and sometimes your own. All it takes is one slip of the knife, the blood of an infected chimpanzee. That single, ordinary accident was enough to let the virus cross from one species into another. But a single infection on its own doesn't create a pandemic. A virus that infects one hunter in an isolated village with no way to spread further simply dies out with him. For this virus to become history's deadliest epidemic, it needed something else entirely: a city. That city was Leopoldville, known today as Kinshasa, capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the moment scientists traced the pandemic's true beginning to wasn't the 1980s. It wasn't even the 1960s. It was the 1920s, 60 years before a single case appeared in Los Angeles. Colonial Central Africa in that era was a perfect storm for a blood-borne virus. Flooded into fast-growing cities for labor, reshaping social and sexual networks. New railways and river routes let people travel between towns faster than ever before. And medical clinics, in an era before disposable needles, were unknowingly reusing contaminated equipment between patients. A virus that might have quietly died out in a single village instead found a perfect highway of human contact, and it took that highway all the way into the following century, spreading silently, unnoticed, for decades before anyone even knew it existed. Here is where the story turns almost unbelievable. How could scientists possibly reconstruct events from the 1920s? You cannot interview a virus, but it turns out you can read its history, written directly into its own genetic mistakes. Remember that clumsy, error-prone way HIV copies itself? Every mutation gets passed down to the next generation of the virus, and the next, mistakes piling on top of mistakes, generation after generation, like a genetic clock ticking forward in time. Compare two samples of the virus, count the differences between them, and you can calculate how long ago they shared a common ancestor. But a clock needs a starting point, and remarkably, scientists found one preserved by accident. A blood sample drawn in Kinshasa in 1959. A piece of tissue removed from a patient in that same city in 1960, sealed in wax and forgotten in a medical archive for decades. Buried inside that forgotten tissue was the genetic fingerprint of the virus itself. A fixed point in time that let scientists calibrate their entire genetic clock and trace the pandemic's true beginning back to the 1920s and its path forward from Central Africa to Haiti during the political upheaval of the 1960s. And finally, by 1970, into New York City itself. The virus was already in America, a full decade before the world had ever heard its name. Which brings us back to where we started. If the virus was already spreading across an entire continent a decade earlier, how did one flight attendant become the man blamed for starting it all? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple and deeply unfair to the man at the center of it. In the earliest days of the epidemic, investigators were mapping how early one man, because he traveled often and could recall many of his contacts, appeared linked to an unusually high number of early cases. Investigators labeled his case file with a simple letter, meaning, at the time, only that he lived outside California. But on the typewriters of that era, a capital letter and the number 0 looked nearly identical. Somewhere in the retelling, that label was misread. A label meaning outside became in print, patient 0. A journalist later built an entire best-selling book around that phrase, and the press ran with the story. The public was desperate to hear one man, one villain, one clean explanation for something terrifying. Years later, when scientists finally sequenced this man's own viral samples and compared them against HIV. Already circulating across America in the 1970s, the truth became undeniable. He wasn't at the root of the outbreak at all. He was simply one case among many, caught in an epidemic that had already been spreading, silently, for years before he was ever diagnosed. An innocent man, blamed for a tragedy that began on another continent half a century before he was born. Perhaps that is the real lesson buried inside this story. When people are frightened, they go looking for someone to blame, usually someone already standing at the margins. It has happened before, and it will likely happen again through forgotten tissue, through the genetic mistakes of a virus itself, turned out to be far more complicated and far more human than any villain ever could be. The easy story and the true story are almost never the same story. If tonight's story moved you, subscribe and join me next time for another journey into history's most misunderstood mysteries.